In the last 70 years, at least a dozen democracies collapsed the same way, not after wars, not after invasions, but after one quiet decision inside US intelligence. One of them was Chile. It had a thriving democracy. It elected its leaders freely for decades. And in a single afternoon in 1973, it was turned into a military dictatorship. Not because of civil war, not because of economic collapse, but because of a checklist, a formula created in this building. Intelligence agencies call it the calculus of intervention. And once you see the pattern, you'll realize history isn't random. There are 3 specific criteria that determine whether your country gets toppled. And they've been used the exact same way for 70 years. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what they are, and you'll see why they're still being used today. Let's break down the formula. Here's what most people think triggers a regime change: evil dictators, humanitarian crises, weapons of mass destruction. Wrong. The CIA and intelligence agencies like it operate on 3 pillars. Think of them as a checklist. If a country hits all 3, the probability of intervention skyrockets. Pillar 1, strategic location. Does this country sit on a trade route? A canal? A border that matters? Is it a domino that, if it falls, threatens a region? Pillar 2, economic interests. Does this country control resources we need? Oil, lithium, copper, rare earth minerals? Or does it threaten the profit margins of corporations with serious lobbying power? Pillar 3, ideological alignment. Is this government tilting toward our enemies? Nationalizing industries? Cozying up to rival superpowers? Hit all 3, and suddenly you're not just a country anymore. You're a problem to be solved. These pillars operate like a probability scale. Hit 1 pillar, you're on the radar. Hit 2, you're in the briefing room. Hit all 3, the machinery starts moving. Let's start with the one that set the template. Iran, 1953. A democratically elected prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh did something unthinkable. He nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. British and American oil profits, billions, were suddenly at risk. But Mossadegh wasn't just an economic threat. Iran sat at the crossroads of the Middle East and Central Asia. Strategic location, check. And he was flirting with Soviet support. Ideological threat, check. The pitch to President Eisenhower wasn't about oil profits. It was about communist expansion, about losing the Middle East, about the dominoes starting to fall. Therefore, in August 1953, the CIA launched Operation Ajax, street protests, paid mobs, a military coup disguised as a popular uprising. Within days, Mossadegh was gone. The Shah, pro-Western, pro-oil deals, was installed. Democracy in Iran, gone for a generation. The calculus worked. The consequences? We're still living them. Because the Shah's regime became so oppressive that it created the perfect conditions for the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The same revolution that turned Iran from a strategic ally into a decades-long adversary. One intervention, 70 years of blowback. 1 year later, Guatemala. President Jacobo Arbenz enacted land reform, redistributing unused land owned by the United Fruit Company to impoverished farmers. Now, you might think, land reform? That's domestic policy. But United Fruit wasn't just any company. It was Guatemala's economy. Railroads, ports, telegraph lines, and its board members connected directly to the CIA and State Department. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, his law firm represented United Fruit. CIA Director Alan Dulles, on the company's board, the line between corporate interests and national security had completely blurred. Therefore, when Arbenz threatened corporate profits, he triggered Pillar 2. Add in Guatemala's strategic position in Central America, Estelle Pillar 1, and whispers that Arbenz was soft on communism. Pillar 3, and you've got a problem. June 1954. Operation PB Success. A CIA-backed invasion. Arbenz fled. A military dictatorship took over, leading to a civil war that killed over 200,000 people over the next 4 decades. And here's the detail that should haunt you. The CIA literally invented propaganda radio stations. They created fake news broadcasts reporting military victories that hadn't happened. They staged psychological warfare so effective that Arbenz' own military abandoned him, not because they were defeated, but because they believed they were defeated. The blueprint for modern disinformation was written in Guatemala in 1954. Now, back to Chile, the country from the beginning. Salvador Allende was elected president in 1970, elected, not imposed, on a platform of democratic socialism. He nationalized copper mines. He expanded social programs. He did it all through legal constitutional means. But Chile produced 20% of the world's copper. American companies like Anaconda and Kennecott stood to lose hundreds of millions. Pillar 2. Chile was the linchpin of South America. If it went red, the entire continent might follow. Pillar 1. And Allende accepted Soviet aid and aligned with Cuba. Pillar 3. Henry Kissinger reportedly said, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people." Read that again. The irresponsibility of its own people. He was talking about voters, about democracy. Therefore, the CIA funneled millions into destabilizing Chile's economy. They funded strikes that crippled the country. They created the economic chaos that would justify military intervention. On September 11, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet launched a coup. Allende died in the presidential palace. What followed was a brutal 17-year dictatorship. Over 3,000 people were killed or disappeared. Over 40,000 were tortured. The calculus worked, again. But here's what makes Chile different. We have the receipts. Declassified documents prove the CIA's involvement. We have the money trails. We have Kissinger's own words. There's no plausible deniability here. So let's talk about how these decisions actually get made. Picture this. You're sitting in a 7th floor conference room at CIA headquarters. There's a country showing signs of instability. The analysts present their case. They don't say, "Let's overthrow this government." They say, "What are our options for managing this situation?" They present 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, diplomatic pressure. Scenario 2, economic sanctions. Scenario 3, covert action. And here's the psychology that makes the calculus so dangerous. Once covert action is on the table, once it's presented as a viable option with a percentage chance of success, it becomes very hard to ignore. The calculus isn't just about whether to intervene. It's about creating a framework where intervention feels inevitable. So here's where it gets interesting. You might be thinking, okay, but that was the Cold War. We don't do that anymore, right? Wrong. The pillars haven't changed. Only the language has. Communist threat became terrorist threat. Nationalization became rogue state. Strategic location now includes drone bases, rare earth minerals for smartphones, and access to data cables under the ocean. Look at Libya, 2011. Gaddafi wasn't just a dictator. He was sitting on Africa's largest oil reserves and threatening to create a gold-backed African currency that would bypass the dollar. Pillar 2 and Pillar 1. The intervention was sold as humanitarian. But when you look at the 3 pillars, they all lit up. Look at Venezuela today, largest proven oil reserves on Earth. Strategic location in South America, ideologically opposed to U.S. interests, all 3 pillars. The calculus is still running, but there's a new element now, public perception. Today, you can't just stage a coup and pretend it was organic. So the modern calculus includes a 4th, unofficial pillar, plausible justification. Can we sell this as humanitarian intervention, or counterterrorism, or supporting democracy? The formula hasn't changed. It's just gotten more sophisticated. But here's the thing about formulas. They're great at solving the immediate problem. They're terrible at predicting what comes next. Iran, 1953, led directly to the 1979 Islamic Revolution and decades of hostility. Guatemala, 1954, civil war, genocide, a refugee crisis that fuels migration to this day. Chile, 1973, Pinochet's dictatorship became a rallying cry for anti-American sentiment across Latin America. Libya, 2011, a failed state a migrant crisis, ISIS training grounds. Every intervention designed to create stability instead created a vacuum, and vacuums don't stay empty. Because here's the brutal truth. You can topple a government in weeks, but you can't build a stable democracy in decades. Not from the outside. Not when the population knows you were behind the coup that killed their elected leaders. The calculus accounts for immediate strategic gains. It doesn't account for generational resentment, for the radicalization that happens when people lose faith in democratic processes because they watched foreign powers override their votes. So let me ask you this. What if stability was never the goal? What if the calculus was never about democracy or freedom or even long-term peace? What if it was always about control? Control of resources, control of trade routes, control of which governments get to exist? Because here's the pattern. Every single time a country hit those three pillars, strategic location, economic interests, ideological threat, intervention followed. And every single time, the country that emerged was more unstable, more violent, more resentful than before. The formula worked, the consequences didn't, or maybe the consequences were always acceptable. Maybe long-term chaos in a foreign country was always preferable to short-term loss of strategic control. Maybe the calculus was working exactly as intended, and so we arrive at the paradox. Every intervention designed to prevent chaos became the very seed of it, because stability, it turns out, was never actually the goal. The calculus of intervention isn't classified anymore. It's historical record. And once you see the pattern, you realize it's not a question of if it will happen again. It's a question of where. Because right now, there are countries lighting up all three pillars. And somewhere in Virginia, someone is running the numbers. The calculus continues.